How do I consider
How do you
myself?
present yourself? Do you present yourself as the last man on the moon?
No. No, I present myself as Gene Cernan, retired captain of the U.S. Navy, former naval aviator, who ended up having I guess a very fortunate period of years in the space program, which took me to the moon a couple times.
And what brought you to speak with the ubiquitous last man on the moon?
I guess I was a child of the 60s, so the moon shots were very much part of my young mind.
No, that's hurting. That hurts.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but it's true. And so I guess, I just sort of grew up with that incredible era. And it never completely leaves you. And so when I eventually morphed into a filmmaker and, you spend time looking for new material and something to make a film about, I guess I just began browsing a few astronaut biographies, and I came across Gene's, and halfway through the book I knew that was the next film I had to try and make.
Part of your background in filmmaking is dealing with a lot of Formula One drivers. I know I saw Sir Jackie Stewart's name as one of the producers on the film. I'm wondering if you see a connection between these sort of action-adventure people that do this for fun versus people who did it as more, in a slightly more professional, but also in a little slightly haphazard way, the craziness of being an astronaut versus the craziness of being
the challenge of doing something you believe is the right thing to do. I think that's the best way I can describe it. Given a chance to do something that you do believe is the right thing to do, and the challenge of doing it.
The difference is he speaks to people who do it for fun, and you did it for duty.
I did a little bit for fun too.
There you go.
Well, I think, if you didn't enjoy the pure thrill of aviation, you wouldn't have been doing it in the first place. But no, I think there's certain parallels between a racing driver, certainly of that era, and astronaut, because, there was a lot in common, actually. It was a very similar era. It was very dangerous. Both Jackie Stewart and Gene Cernan lost close friends in the pursuit of what they loved doing. There was a certain glamorous aspect to it as well. It was, all the cameras were on that world, and I guess whether you're a racing driver or a movie star or an astronaut, a small special band of individuals almost make that journey on our behalf. As Gene says in the film, it was mankind that was going to the moon, and a piece of the world, all of us was on that spacecraft.
There's a common culture. A number of our guys, we all went to Indianapolis. I went to Purdue University. I used to go down to Indianapolis every year to watch the time trials. Why? Because they were exciting. Mm-hmm. And a lot of race car drivers either fly themselves or they certainly have their own airplane because of the allure of flying. I mean, if you got it, you got it. If you don't got it, you don't got it. Does that make sense?
Are they all jealous that you are literally the fastest man that has ever lived?
Well, I had a couple interviews over the years with race car drivers, and introduced as I wouldn't, but they were introduced as the fastest guy in the world. There's two fastest. Number one, on Apollo 10, we came in faster than any human being will come in until we return from Mars. And that day will come. But also, I drove the lunar rover on the moon, and it didn't go very fast, but I went downhill, down one of the mountainsides, at something like 14 kilometers per hour. That didn't sound very fast, does it? But you add the rotation of the moon around the Earth, and it's pretty doggone fast. No one, I think, will exceed that record for a little while.
You mentioned Purdue. Your background was obviously engineering.
Engineering. My dad I had a dream as a kid during World War II about flying. Unbeknown to me, my dad had a dream about me getting the education he never had a chance to get. And I ended up at Purdue thanks to sacrifices he and my mom went through to get me there. And way back in 1956, and I know to most people that's before God created water. But
it was in black and white then, right?
In black and white. And I hate to say it, as I grew up, we didn't have television, much less iPhones. Those dreams were never competitive, but they came together because I graduated from Purdue going through Naval ROTC and had orders to Pensacola, Florida for naval flight training in one hand and an engineering degree in the other hand. And there was no space program. Al Shepard didn't fly until 1961, and I think it was 1958 before Sputnik flew. But that's where I took, without knowing it, that's where I took those first steps to the moon. And within 10 years, you would put me in a straitjacket if I told you this back in 1956. Within 10 years, I was the second American to walk in space around the world. It's almost arrogant for me to say that to you, but that's not one of the tricks, but fate played a great deal, had a great impact on my life.
We'll talk about fate, because there's a lot of stuff that has happened to you because of fate, because of chance, because of tragedy.
Tragedies, all kinds of things.
But I do want to focus on this thing. You started out in engineering, you then became obviously a pilot, so you're within a military context of a pilot. These are very pragmatic pursuits. Yes, they're fun, yes, they're action, yes, they're adventure, but they're very much that you have a mission and the goal is to complete the mission. You have an assignment, the goal is to complete the assignment. There's no room for poetry here. There's no room for wonder here. Do you think you being in space, and specifically, do you think you being on the moon has opened you up to be slightly more poetic? You said some beautiful words when you were leaving the moon. Is the sense of wonder of science and the sense of joy of being in the moon something which simply engineering cannot actually designate?
Simply, yes. I've been, early on in the space program, there were people who said, we need to send artists to the moon, we need to send poets to the moon, forget these scientists and engineers. Of course, we were all aviators at that point in time, and I believe my engineering background played a tremendous role in my flying ability and what came thereafter. But I don't know what it did to me. I get a lot of people saying what you just said. I've heard so many poetic words come out of you. I don't know where I've got them. I don't have that background in my family. But when you go where I've gone, and in those days, no one else had been there before. I mean, today, space flight is sort of a regular thing, although we're not exploring space anymore because we're not leaving Earth orbit. We're just exploiting space. You just say it as it comes to you. And I think Marx knows that. As long as we spent talking and putting this film together, he'd say, well, tell me about this. And the words, I take it as a great compliment, but the words just came out the way I saw it, the way I felt. I think feeling is a very difficult thing to define.
The argument is this: if it was strictly for science that we were going to the moon, we could absolutely send the equivalent of a drone. We could send robots. We could send. The advantage of sending a human is that we can sit here and speak with the human that actually set foot on the moon. And we can hear the poetry of the human that has actually experienced that.
The question I get asked, I can tell you the top 10 questions. One of the first is, what did it feel like to stand on the surface of the moon and look back home? Only a human being can give you that thought. Now, and you'll find out, in those early days, we had some, I don't know how many of us, 30, 35 people. They all didn't go to the moon. We probably all felt differently. We all come back and find a way. Maybe some of us felt the same. But even at that, we would come back and tell you, use the words to try and convey those feelings to you differently. We're all individually different. We're all human beings. We all bleed alike. We all, walk. We all, but we're different inside. And I use the words after Apollo 17. I used the words in my book. I felt like, the way I can describe it to you or anybody else, because I wanted to bring it back and show it to you. Here's what it, quote, feels like to see this Earth of ours, multi-blues of the oceans and whites of the snow and the clouds, three-dimensionally, dynamically turning on an axis you can't see, surrounded by this blackness that I define, I call it, and not just infinity, I don't know that we know what that is, but I call it the endlessness of space and the endlessness of time. And I can understand that. And when I say I sat on God's front porch for 3 days of my life, I leave how that feels up to you. Let your imagination take you to God's front porch and you look back home. That's the only thing I can do short of taking it back with me. Now, a robot, a machine, whatever, people, that's the question. How did it feel? This is 40 and 50 years later. They don't ask, what was the speed through the parallel and the apolloon, and how many digits did you have, and what was your memory in the computer? They don't care. The technology of Apollo is long since been overshadowed by time, and in this day and age obsolete. But the human spirit, the spiritual feeling, the philosophical thoughts you had when you were on your way or on your way home override the technical aspects of the trips we took. And I think that's true for all of us, no matter how we try and describe it or share it with you.
One of the things that the film does, I think, remarkably, is actually gets a number of the Apollo generation, it's called the sort of golden age of NASA generation, to be speaking in a slightly more, for lack of a better word, emotional way. You have people like Gene Kraft, who I've seen many interviews in the past where it's been very precise, very engineering. It seems that they're allowing for nostalgia now. They're allowing for a recognition that this was an era which is not with us. It's maybe not past for good, but it's certainly past for now. Just wondering if you could talk about how you did those interviews and how you set the mood for them to finally tell the stories in this sort of slightly deeper way.
Well, I did all the interviews in the film, and you know, you get a little bit of time beforehand to sort of connect with the person, and in those few minutes you can certainly open up in yourself, and you can put across to them, you know, quite quickly that you're not a scientist. You know, I'm not a historian. I'm not an overly intellectual academic. I wasn't wanting to make one of those kind of films, and I really just did my best to try and connect with them on a very, you know, fundamental human level. And I would reference Gene's book, which speaks in a very open and emotive way, and you know, hopefully, as the interview unfolded, you know, I would capture, you know, some of the more human comments that I was looking for. But Gene himself will say that the 60s was a different era. A lot of the NASA family came from a military background, and there's a very much sort of more macho persona around there, and people didn't talk about death or being scared or how they felt, you know. But I think when you have been on this earth and lived a life for a certain amount of time, you can look back, certainly from the age Gene is now, and actually shed a lot of that and look at that time with a completely new perspective.
You mellow as you get older. You're willing to talk about things as you used a word. We were too macho, even to talk to each other about how you felt and did you feel any closer to God. We didn't talk about that. We talked about the mission, the goal, what we had to accomplish. And, you know, you got to find words. When I'm talking to you, anybody who might be listening, you got to find words that they understand. You're not communicating if you talk above their head. They say, oh, that's great, wonderful, and I walk away. I just heard the Last Man on the Moon. Tell me about it. Well, what did he say? I don't know. You got to share and give back where you've been and what you've done in a language, in words that people can relate to. They can relate to fear, apprehension, scared. They can relate to those words. They could then, and they can today. You know, we can change the technology that kids have at their disposal today, but they still know what it quote feels like if they stub their toe. There's only one way to explain it. It hurts. It hurt 50 years ago, and it hurts today. Talk to them in a language that they can relate to.
Just for the record, in December 1972, I was 6 months old, and you could still kick my ass. So I have no doubt about that. You can pretend that the macho is not there, but I believe full thing that if it comes to a fist fight between the two of us, you are totally taking me out. Now, if we could talk a little bit about these sort of
It's his bionic knees that'll
Well,
do
there-
you.
Yeah, I got more steel in me than an anchor chain.
high technology. If we could talk, because part of your career are these remarkable tragedies and coincidences. Obviously
Both.
Obviously tied. You would never have got, as I say Gemini, you say Gemini. You would never got on Gemini if it wasn't for a tragedy. You probably wouldn't have got.
Well, I would have. I was assigned a Gemini 12. I would have flown in Gemini if there wasn't a Gemini 9 tragedy. I ended up moving up to Gemini 9, which gave me a head start, quite frankly.
I thought you were on 13, which was canceled in favor of Apollo.
Well, yeah, well, no, I was going to fly. Tom Stafford and I were going to fly Gemini 12. We were 3 missions behind. We would have rolled over. Well, we were backed up 9, rolled over to 12. And see, that changed a lot of things, because Buzz Aldrin, who was going to back up 12, there was no 15 to roll over to. So, and then the Apollo 1 accident. Would those guys have flown again? You bet your life they would. Roger would have been a lunar module pilot. Ed White would have been a commander. I can tell you a million things, and I don't believe in coincidences. I accept the word fate had a big impact. I don't believe in coincidence. I think something put you in a position for fate to have an impact.
Why were you given the command of 17?
Same old question I've been asking myself since day one. Why was I?
What did you have that the other crew didn't have?
Well, I don't know. Why was I selected for the space program? I didn't apply. I didn't meet their requirements. I hadn't gone to test pilot school, didn't have enough jet time, and I was selected over some guys who I thought were can't miss. I can take that all the way through flight assignments and what have you. It came to Apollo 17, and we spread the flights out. So Dick Gordon and his crew, with Jack Schmitt, a geologist, it was decreed from Washington, whoever flew 17, Jack Schmitt was going to be on that crew. We needed a geologist, and it was the right decision. It hurt.
From a science decision, from an engineering decision, it makes sense.
It makes absolutely sense.
But it was a human decision to put you on 17, and that's what I'm
Well,
getting at.
from a human decision, Joe Engle might have been, and all due respect to Jack, because he did an outstanding job. And Jack had some he was a scientist, but he had some philosophical instincts as well. But Joe was everybody's buddy. He could relate to anybody and everybody. X-15 pilot. So give him credit for being a technologist to a degree. Why me is a question I've asked myself, and he knows because I've asked him. Why me? I can give you all kinds of insight. Why me? I went to the cemetery at Arlington. It's in this movie. There was a lot more film that you see in the movie about the cemetery, and I kept asking myself, why me? Why am I not beneath that headstone instead of Charlie Bassett or Roger Chaffee? Or Gus Grissom. Why am I here? Why are they not here and I'm not there? Why did I get selected for Apollo 17? I was as honest as I could be in my book. It's in the book. I said if I were my boss, looking at the qualifications of Dick Gordon, which were outstanding, naval aviator, all kinds of records, test pilot school. He had another very capable guy with him, and he had a geologist, Jack Schmitt. They were a crew. They trained as a crew. They were ready to fly in case the Apollo 15 prime crew. We were backed up 14. We were ready to go as a crew. The only difference was Jack Schmitt, the scientist, the geologist, was on Dick's crew. And I said, if I were my boss, and I just crashed a helicopter a week before Apollo 14. Unfortunately, part of what's in the movie is maybe one of the best things I ever did, because after I crashed it, Deke Slayton said, "Oh, when did the engine quit, Gene?" I said, "Well, it didn't quit, Deke." He said, "Well, when did it first sputter?" I said, "It didn't sputter." "Well, when did that gust of wind get a hold of you?" And I said, "Deke, I flew it into the water. He says, no, that's not what I asked you. He said, Deke, there's no other, I flew it into the water. He said, you don't understand. I got to go downstairs and talk to about 50 reporters who are going to ask me how the accident occurred. You're going to have me tell them you flew it in the water? I said, Deke, what else can I tell you? You're going to find out anyway, eventually. I flew it into the water. I did a dumb thing. It was at that, along with the fact that Dick Gordon had the geologist Jack Schmitt on his crew, and the fact that I did a very dumb thing, which I didn't have to do. You know, I could have killed myself. That wasn't the point. I just did a dumb thing. That I knew I was not going to get command of Apollo 17. The one thing I wanted more than anything else. I gave up the chance to fly to the moon on an earlier flight from the right seat. I needed to prove to myself, and I said it in the movie, I needed to prove to myself that I was good enough, that I could do it. I needed it. Don't ask me why. I just needed to prove, not to you, but to me, that I could do it. And here I wasn't going to get a chance. And then lo and behold, I got the crew. I got the flight. Why me?
If I may be so
Please,
bold,
dear God,
you're
tell me
answering
how.
your own question.
I
Or
don't know
my
why.
own question.
I don't know why.
Why you, so that you could be here to tell this story? Why you, so that you could actually put it in a phrase? Because when you were asked about the helicopter crash, you did not put it off on somebody else. You did not put it off on electronic failure. You put it on you, and the sense of being able to tell the narrative and be able to tell the story and to be able to be honest about a critical situation is why you. And you're right that it's because of luck, but it's also because of skill and tenacity and honesty. And it seems this comes out in the film.
I always felt like a little bit of underdog, and I felt whether I was in a left seat, right seat, no matter where I was, even before I got in a space program, coming aboard ship, OK3 wire was as good as you could get. Instead of there's an LSO, a landing signal officer grade, high and fast, slow in the groove, whatever. OK3 wire means, man, you can't do it any better than that. And I always felt I needed to do it better. I needed to do it as good or better than it ever had been done before. And I felt that way on that first Gemini 9 flight. That's where I really disappointed myself, because we were doing something, we were in an environment we'd never really been in before. But when I finally got command of Apollo 17, you know, I was in control of my own destiny. Once we lifted off, no one could take that flight away from me. When it came my time to fly those last 14 minutes down to the surface and land this thing, not just successfully, but where I wanted to land it, I knew that I could land it as good or better than it had ever been done. Now, that's not a knock on my colleagues, because they were phenomenal pilots. I had to do that.
Briefly, night carrier landing, Apollo 10. What was more strenuous?
I tell you
The
what.
spinning in Apollo 10.
Well, spinning in Apollo 10 was something that happened, and night carrier landings a little different. I tell you, when you come aboard ship at night, you know, 10,000 miles in the middle of the ocean, and there's no moon, there's nothing but a satellite this way and this way, and you look over your shoulder, and it's only you and your maker. There's nobody else with you. If you're going to do it, you got to do it. It ain't going to happen by accident. It ain't going to happen. You've got to do it. So not only do you want that OK3 wire, at a very minimum, you want to land aboard the ship and keep from killing yourself. That's a strong motivation. And I've always said one of the most competitive things I've ever done, and some people find this hard to say, is coming aboard at night. Mm-hmm. The challenge of landing on the moon certainly was that you only had one shot. But if you kill yourself on a fantail of a ship or on the moon,
in fairness, killing yourself on the other side of the moon.
You're still dead. People aren't going to look at it that way, but and it's not quite that simple. But landed on the moon required all the capability and preciseness that you could muster, but so did landing aboard a ship. And maybe maybe that's the answer to a question a lot of people ask me. How come 5 out of 6 lunar landings were commanded by naval aviators? And the 7th, Apollo 13, was commanded by a naval aviator. Why? That's another good question. Why?
The film, you interview many of the quote-unquote usual suspects. Obviously, Lovell's participation was extraordinary. You didn't get a chance to speak to Mr. Armstrong, but incredibly moving words from him. Without getting into some of the drama, perhaps the most loquacious astronaut that has been in the last several decades has been Buzz Aldrin. Was his participation in this film, his non-inclusion in this film, an issue? Was there a reason that he wasn't discussed? Is there some sort of part of his story which was not told or directly associated with this?
I think I wanted to make a film, using people that we hadn't seen a lot of. And I think Buzz Aldrin, with all due respect to him, he's had a lot of exposure. Everybody knows Buzz Aldrin and that story. And my focus was very much on the last man on the moon and his personal circle of friends and personal buddies. And I don't think, you and Buzz overlap that much. He's not a big part of your life today, is he?
In all due respect to Buzz, because he did one hell of a job on Apollo 11, Buzz, you would have a tough time communicating with Buzz. He would talk to you, but you wouldn't know what he's saying. He'd talk way above your head and my head most of the time. And yet he is that second man to land on the moon. And as I say, he certainly got to give him credit for that. One interesting thing, as long as we're being honest with each other, Jack Schmitt, I will say, that decision was the right decision to fly Jack Schmitt. He was a microgeologist. I was looking at the big picture, so together the scientists, the geologists on the ground were overwhelmed. And Jack and I are good friends. We get along. We talk to each other on an anniversary and one thing or another. But Jack really had no desire to be part. I thought he should have been part of this film, but Jack just avoided being in a position, and we've asked him, I'd call him, and he just wasn't available. And that's fine, and that was his decision. I wish he'd been in it because you know what? If you talk about the last man on the moon, it was Jack Schmitt. If you talk about the last man to have left his footprints on the moon, you're looking at him. I didn't label myself as the last man on the moon. The press labeled me as the last, because how does it feel to be the tail of the dog? How does it feel to be the last one over the fence? And I heard that so many times, and they pinned this last man on the moon on me. I didn't. People seem to enjoy that. I don't know. It is what it is.
I find it absolutely fascinating, the dynamic that existed between Neil and Buzz. You had two incredibly competitive people, but you had the person who was more quiet who ended up being the first person on, the person whose poetry, when he landed, was allowed to speak, who landed to speak directly to it, whereas Buzz, who was much more gregarious, much more outgoing. The dynamic between you and your partner, and we'll sort of wrap up on this. Just wondering if you could talk about when it was all said and done, and you were leaving the moon for the last time, which you never thought would be the last time for decades, what message did the moon speak to you? And what do you want this film to do for future generations that are going to be looking at it back?
Leaving the moon, the first steps, people ask me, what were the first steps like? Well, the first step had been taken long before I got there, but the last steps were mine, and no one can take them away from me. And that was what I was looking for. I said a little bit ago, I needed to prove to myself. But when I left the moon, that was a nostalgic moment. I looked down on my last footprints. I didn't want to leave. But Jack didn't need it. We wanted to stay there another day. We didn't have the consumables, water, oxygen, or what it took. And I wanted desperately to bring something home to those people who stood behind in wonderment about what we were doing. And, the human aspect again, and share or give or bring back. I want to stop time. I want to push the freeze button. I want to stand in that ladder and look at that moon that's been watching me over my shoulder for the last 3 days and come back with something. And, we were extension of technology, wonderful. But it was far more than that. You know, there's two different space programs, one in Earth orbit and one when you go to the moon. They're technologically different, they're philosophically different, and they're spiritually different. I didn't say religiously, I said spiritually. And I wanted someone cut out what the piece of your heart that's called feeling and plug it in, and now you'll know what it's like, okay? Let me get an extension cord, turn it on, and let it talk to you. And I couldn't find what it was. And that's when I just wanted to take it, bring it in, and say, here it is, look at it.
Does the movie help do that?
The movie has been very nostalgic also because it took me back to places that I remember, but I've sort of long since forgot. Brought things back to me.
Some that you didn't want brought back.
Brought back to me things, yeah, maybe I didn't want to talk about it. It took me places I forgot. Well, I didn't forget, but I saw the Gemini 9 accident. When I saw that T-30, I know what happened to the guys. I'm not going to tell you because it's not worth saying it. They got killed. Let's leave it at that. When I saw that T-38 with the whole top section cut off and in nothing but charcoal, I'd never seen that picture before. And yet, in the next 2 seconds, I'm standing there in front of that wreckage. I remember being there, but I don't remember seeing it. Yeah, it brought that back loud and clear to me. The sacrifices that we paid to meet Kennedy's challenge were probably expected in one shape or another, but no one could predict that we'd lose 3 men in Apollo before we got off the ground. After we got off the ground, somewhere along the way, we didn't talk about that either, but we figured it was more than a 50-50 possibility that would happen. Think about this, and this is something I think everyone could be proud of. Everyone who went to the moon, including the crew of Apollo 13, has come home to talk about it. How about that? No one could have predicted that 50 years ago.
Fantastic. Such an honor.
Hey, God, you know what I like? This is one of the best
Very good
interviews
questions. Thank you.
I've ever had.